Afrocentricity is the idea that we're viewing the phenomenon from an African-centered perspective, studying the world from that perspective. I think the most important aspect of it is that the people can see it and people can be influenced by the ideas that are on the program. That it takes ideas beyond the campus and it makes people aware of ideas that they never have thought of before. Welcome to Afrocentricity. I'm your host, Michael Washington. We have a historic program today titled Role Models of Prophetic Justice Ministries. Let me begin by spending just a few moments providing the context for our discussion. I will title my remarks, Role Models of Prophetic Justice. The very existence of the proposed legislation called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 is an example of the prophetic outcomes made possible by role models of justice. By prophetic outcomes, we mean the product of the divine will of justice-seeking role models. By role models, we mean human beings or people whose lifestyles are authentic representations of their beliefs. In this case, the belief is justice, so that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 proposal is the product of the divine will of people who represent justice. An important responsibility of a person who defines her or himself as a role model is the mentoring of others to sustain their system of belief. By mentoring, we mean the process of being a trusted counselor, tutor, or coach. Arguably, if John Lewis had his way, the proposed legislation would not bear his name alone, but would be shared with someone who had mentored him. Because of his extraordinary respect for elders, he was too humble to propagate the idea that his name be elevated above the people that he himself emulated as models of integrity and authenticity. Therefore, one would not have been surprised if Representative Lewis favored the idea of sharing the proposed legislation's name with the Reverend Cordy Tyndale Vivian. As prophecy would have it, although in different locations, they both passed away on exactly the same day, which was July 17th, 2020. Reverend Vivian, who was affectionately known as CT, had been a respected elder of Lewis since 1960 when they were involved in the Nashville sit-in. The youth in SNCC and the elders in SCLC did not always see eye to eye, but they did share in common a style of living based on taking nonviolent direct action against oppressive institutions, lifestyles that resulted in the undoing of Jim Crow segregation. By the late 1970s, that style of living was on the wane, and the meeting at CT's home was called to address this concern. What emerged from that meeting was nothing less than the fulfillment of prophecy. Dr. James Norman Dunn, a social work professor at Antioch College and mentee of Reverend Vivian, would coin the term undoing racism to describe the educational training model that he and a white minister named Iberis Hacker designed for grassroots community organizers to sustain the values and strategies of the justice movement. By the time of Dr. Dunn's death in 1989, the undoing racism method of taking nonviolent direct action had become endorsed by reputable justice organizations across the nation, such as Clergy and Laity Concerned, or CALC. Which was co-founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s as a voice against the Vietnam War. This is a shot of members of the very first cohort trained in the undoing racism method of community organizing, taken at the home of John and Sheila Collins. John was the executive director of CALC. To a considerable extent, the endorsements were the result of the proven success of the undoing racism method in achieving positive results. An example of success is the Youth Against Militarism, or YAM, group, whose effectiveness with the undoing racism method was instrumental in defeating a Cincinnati Public Schools military academy proposal throughout the decade of the 1980s. Notice the white woman standing next to Reverend Vivian is Ann Braden. In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King identified Braden as an authentic role model for white clergymen and women to emulate regarding moral and ethical conduct as it relates to the movement. Another example of success was a national campaign that saved the lives of Mayor Eddie Carthan and the Tachula Seven, who had been targeted by officials in the state of Mississippi for assassination because of their unwillingness to comply with white supremacists who sought to maintain racial segregation. Being a mentor to Dr. Dunn was not the only thing that may have compelled Representative Lewis, if he had his way, to name Reverend Vivian as a worthy co-candidate to be named to honor the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. In 1977, Reverend Vivian founded the Black Action Strategies and Information Center, known as BASICS, with the assistance of Ann Braden of Louisville, Kentucky. In 1979, he founded the National Anti-Klan Network, which later became the Center for Democratic Renewal. And in 1984, he served in Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign as National Deputy Director for Clergy. 4 decades after the murder of Dr. King, in 2008, he founded the C.T. Vivian Leadership Institute to train a new generation of community organizers and leaders. 5 years later, on August 8th, 2013, a prophetic moment in the history of the United States occurred when President Barack Obama awarded Reverend Vivian the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The very image of both men standing together as revered national leaders in a country structured on white supremacy brings tears to the eyes of those connected to the sacred power of prophetic justice. Reverend Vivian, whose life's work was dedicated to a lifestyle of undoing the vestiges of white supremacy by means of nonviolent direct action, is being honored by the most powerful man on planet Earth, who himself a community organizer from Chicago, and according to the DNA analysis of the Ancestry.com, is the 11th great-grandson of John Punch, who in 1640 was the first person of African descent to legally receive lifetime servitude in the history of the United States. Punch's bondage became the genesis of legalized racial enslavement, or racial slavery. There they stood together on the same platform, each one honoring the other for manifesting the divine will of generations of prophets and of countless numbers of others who were believers in justice. If John Punch is the model of racial dehumanization, then Reverend Vivian's lifestyle of undoing manifestations of white supremacy through nonviolent direct action is an antidote to the normal patterns of behavior that sustain the race-structured status quo. It is a lifestyle of empowerment. Reverend Vivian himself was empowered by mentors such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who himself had mentors such as Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman. Mays began mentoring Dr. King around 1944 and became known as King's intellectual father, while King became known as his spiritual son. Howard Thurman, another inspiration to King, was the first African American to meet Mahatma Gandhi. He was a mystic and the first significant black pacifist, which was his way of addressing the implicit violence that he believed existed with almost every interaction between whites and blacks in the United States. We can see then that role models are critical to the process of sustaining a standard of ethical behavior that creates the possibility of justice. Without the willingness to be held accountable to moral standards and ethical conduct, the very tools of analyses, strategies, and tactics used to empower vulnerable communities may be deployed against poor people. This is the case when community-based organizations provide anti-racist trainings that are too expensive for poor people to afford. The intended purpose of Dr. Dunn's Undoing Racism model was to sustain the justice movement by equipping poor people with the analysis and skills to hold institutional gatekeepers accountable for justice, or at least allowing equitable access to services. By the turn of the 21st century, Dr. Dunn's curriculum had been altered to appeal to groups that could afford to pay thousands of dollars for the training. This was done in part by eliminating from the workshop the community organizing component that empowered poor people with the nonviolent direct action techniques that were effectively employed by Reverend Vivian and others during the tumultuous days of the movement. What this meant is the training that was initially designed for poor people to gain a sense of their collective power was now being sold to institutions that perpetuate a race-structured status quo without follow-up trainings for community-based constituents. The transformation of a curriculum that was designed for the empowerment of poor people into a lucrative commodity to financially benefit unaccountable community organizations has had a crippling effect on poor and especially black communities. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where hundreds of undoing racism workshops were contracted with the state's child welfare services for roughly the first 15 years of the 21st century. By March 13th, 2020, hundreds of teachers, police officers, social workers, lawyers, judges, clergy, etc., had attended these workshops. Yet, because only these institutional gatekeepers were equipped with a clear definition of racism and the ability to analyze the poor people's power, Breonna Taylor was gunned down in her own home by the police and the institutional gatekeepers in law enforcement allowed the incident to be swept under the rug with no expectation of accountability. Had it not been for the community activism that was inspired by the multiracial nonviolent national movement that emerged in the wake of the murder of George Floyd 2 months later, it was highly likely that the gatekeepers would have remained successful in keeping the event from public scrutiny. From the perspective of state officials, the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on the workshops that buffered them from the demands of organized poor communities paid off when Daniel J. Cameron was elected the 51st Attorney General of Kentucky. In that capacity, Cameron is legal counsel to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. As the chief law enforcement officer for the Commonwealth, his commitment to the Kentucky Fraternal Order of Police has aligned the Attorney General's office against Kentucky's black communities, as the poor and black communities seek justice in health care, education, law enforcement, etc. The institutional gatekeepers who can afford to pay for the workshops are being mentored on the national level to prevent poor people and people of color from having access to justice. Moreover, as disproportionate and disparate outcomes continue to plague black youth in the Commonwealth's child welfare services, the Attorney General of Kentucky can be expected to recruit anti-racist training models that continue to disinvest in poor communities so that institutional gatekeeping can go unabated. The strategic success in marketing the Undoing Racism workshops to the institutional gatekeepers at the expense of the poor allows a small number of people of color to empower huge numbers of institutional gatekeepers to deny poor people equitable access to their institutions. Never before in the history of justice, of the pursuit of justice, have so many people been so strategically disempowered by so few. Because of this, there is an urgency to bring hope to disempowered communities throughout the United States and the world. The legacy of disempowering poor communities by unaccountable, profit-driven, anti-racist training groups must be countered by prophecy-inspired agents of social change. It is for this reason that this panel has been assembled. The program today is a tribute to a prophetic justice mentor whose proteges or mentees are bringing hope to poor communities throughout the United States. Here to introduce our panelists and to provide a deeper insight into today's discussion is the renowned community organizer and human rights advocate, Daniel Allen Buford.
So we're glad to have Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. here, and our title for our Zoom talk today has to do with role models of prophetic justice. He is the illustrious pastor of a church that grew up out of the concrete of the inner city to become an oasis for many, many people. Now, before we talk to Dr. Smith about some of his role models around prophetic justice, let me turn to a word of scripture that really clarifies and defines what it is before we move on. And that scripture can be found in the New Testament and the Gospel of St. Luke, and reading in the 4th chapter of Luke, and reading verses 16 to 18. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." Now, when Jesus was reading that passage of scripture, he was actually reading a scripture that had been written years prior to that by Isaiah. And so the essence of prophetic justice has to do with speaking up for the voiceless, helping the helpless, being there for those who are the left out, the least, the offscouring of society. If you want to know what prophetic justice ministry is, consult with Ezekiel in the 3rd chapter, when he talks about sitting with the people of the captivity in Babylon, and he says, "And I sat where they sat." See, to be involved with prophetic justice ministry, you must sit where the people sit. And if you do that, you'll be astonished, and then the word will come to you as to what you must do to help them, to be with them, to be an ally for them, to be an advocate with them, to be a supporter with them, to be a fellow co-laborer with them who have been left out. So then what a prophet would do, or prophets do, actually prophets are policy analysts for the Lord. That's how I chose to define my role at Allen Temple Baptist Church. I was hired by Dr. J. Alfred Smith Jr. For this particular role, and that had been carved out by J. Alfred Smith Sr. So Dr. Smith Sr. created a great model, church model, to work within and work from out of. But many times we see a great man like that, and we see him as a role model. I mean, he's certainly got a lot of role models, even on this phone, who listen to him. So he is a role model who creates role models. So I'm curious, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr., who were your earliest influences to make you have a voice, to be as strong as you do, stand for justice? If you could just, I have several questions I want to ask you, but I just wanted to see if you could talk about your earliest influence sir, to speak out on justice.
It started with my grandmother and my mother. Basically, my grandmother was the matriarch of our family, and the family was living in Mississippi. And at that time, they were lynching blacks in Mississippi, and there was an exodus out of Mississippi up toward the north in northern states. And we had to leave Mississippi because the life of my uncle, my grandmother's son, was in jeopardy. He was working on the plantation, and the plantation owner's daughter made sexual advances toward him. And when he came home and told my grandmother about it, she didn't want a noose around his neck. So we had to leave by night, and we traveled up north on the Missouri Pacific Railroad and ran out of funds trying to get to Chicago, which was hopefully going to be the Canaan land, the land of milk and honey.
Yes, sir.
So we ended up in Kansas City. And Kansas City was in Missouri, a slave state with the northern exposure. And that northern exposure is that great race leaders and justice leaders would come to town, like the head of the NAACP, Walter White, and A. Philip Randolph, the great head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the union. And my grandmother would insist that I would go to hear these speakers. I didn't understand what they were saying, but she was socializing me to be conscious. She was helping her grandson understand how he would have to negotiate racism. So she introduced me to the great racial leaders. Today is February 1st, the first day of the month. And this month has been known as Negro History Month. And so it was my mother that introduced me. And she introduced me to my history by having me to read Black newspapers. And I began to learn about my history. I also learned from my grandmother that I had flowing through my veins the blood of Cherokee Indians, and it made me sensitive to the fact that when we talk about reparations being paid to Black people, we forget that the Native Americans not only had the land stolen from them. I'm trying to make it plain.
Yes, sir, you're doing it.
They use the Bible to justify this kind of action. I won't theologize about that. But when you were talking about Luke 4, you did not go into deep depth because you got a lot of ground to cover. Talking about Jesus saying that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me.
Yes, sir.
Because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to release the captives, to be an advocate for the last, the least, and the lowest. And you said that's the job of the prophet. But in this verse, we find that when he finished, the Bible says, so all who bore witness to him marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And he said, is this not Joseph's son? Some preach for praise, some preach for adulation, but that's not all. If you go down farther, I think it said that when he started talking about the fact that God has a preferential priority for those at the bottom, and he talked about the lepers that were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except the leper. So all those in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath, and they rose up and thrust him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built, that they might throw him down over the cliff.
Sir, that's
so
a good, that's a
prophet is in danger.
Mhm.
Did I make it plain?
Oh man, you're doing it. You're doing it. I wish we could go into where I think you're going with that, but let me just stop you for just a moment and say that what you have done is that you illustrated that there's more to being involved with the prophetic message than just the message itself, or even dealing with the people. That there's an aftermath, there's a backlash, there's a repercussion. And that's why a lot of people steer clear of it. You have that experience as a pastor, as do I, of taking stands and standing with people when other people don't want to be bothered with them. I wish that you could talk for a moment about your relationship to the Black Panther Party for self-defense when it was coming up in Oakland at the time when you were a pastor there, and how you were able to stand with people that everybody else was looking at as being bad people and terrorists, et cetera.
Yes. Well, I was ostracized by the Ministerial Association that didn't want to have anything to do with me because they believed the garbage that people had about Black Panthers, and there were young boys in my congregation who identified with the Panthers because the Panthers were the only institution, the only organization that preceded Black Lives Matter. It's the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And I got tired of seeing police shooting Black boys in the back who were running away from them. And as they would climb a fence, they would get shot in the back. And the preachers were talking about the sweet by and by. And I was concerned about the nasty now and now.
Yes, sir.
And my own congregation, there were people who didn't understand what I was doing, but their children did.
Yes.
And I had one lady, she said, Pastor, I don't understand you, but my children understand you. And if you can keep them in church, because they understand you. I'm going to support you. Mrs. Anna Van, now sleeping in glory.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for that.
You got Reginald Lyles on, who was a Black Panther and who can go into depth when you talk about the risk. I got beat up for standing up for justice in the streets. They wanted me to stay in the secure walls of the sanctuary, but it was Deacon Reginald Lyles that took me to the hospital. And he could tell you that when they got through sewing me up, I had him to bring me right back to the church so I could finish explaining the scriptures about justice.
Now, on that point, by the time these things preceded my coming to California and being involved with the ministry there at Allen Temple, but one thing that did happen while I was there, and you were there, I can remember vividly how you talked about the hospital, and I can remember vividly how you got out of the hospital maybe less than a week. I don't know what the time period was when Oscar Grant was killed, and you stood with Minister Keith Muhammad and myself and at least 100 other ministers, most of them the younger ones, but
younger Protestant ministers and a number of Islamic ministers.
Yes, sir. And this is my last question for you on that. Could you just describe the importance of standing with a young Muslim minister like Keith Muhammad in terms of your elder statesman's stature in that particular issue on the Oscar Grant case?
Well, the small measure of credibility that I had in the community as being a servant of the people, one concerned about the interests of the people, as being a person of integrity, meant that if I endorsed a young Muslim, he must be all right.
Yes, sir. Amen. Amen. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here with us, and I hope you can stay involved with the conversation as it evolves, and people respond to some of the things that you have said, as well as throw their own ideas out in the mix for consideration. So thank you, my friend, mentor, and my coach.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. You just stay with us here. So next, we have Dr. David Billings, the author of the book Deep Denial. David, in your book, you talk about a family meeting that took place after your uncle was killed by a young Black man who was the accused murderer. Could you describe your path that led you to the role models who influenced you to become an anti-racist? I know I'm jumping over a lot of your own personal history and development here, but after reading that passage, I was curious as to what was it that attracted you to anti-racist role models that you eventually found yourself emulating?
Well, thank you, Reverend Buford, and it was a pleasure to hear Dr. Alfred Smith, Sr., who is living testimony that your role models are those who influence you, whom you might not have had the honor of meeting, but their impact was nonetheless profound. And I have heard of Dr. Smith largely through Reverend Buford for years now. And along with others, the murder of my uncle in Macomb, Mississippi in 1962 actually, was what when I look at my journey, I use as the starting point. And that is because there was a family meeting, or at least the men of the family, after the murder, and members of the Klan came to the family meeting, and they were not masked. They were all known by the adults in my family. And I was not old enough, but I was in the other room. And when they asked, what would you have us do? I knew exactly what that question was about. And that was whether or not the family wanted this young man murdered, hung, disappeared. And when it got to my Uncle James, because there were 7 uncles in that circle, my Uncle James said, we don't want you to do nothing. We're not that kind of family. And I remember that, of taking what can only be described as a sigh of relief, because I wasn't sure what kind of family we were. You know, we were in every way a part of the white supremacist environment of Mississippi at that time. And so I start off my own understanding with that moment in my personal history, but it led me a few years later to others who profoundly impacted my development of what we now call critical race theory or anti-racist organizing. And many of you are on the screen, and I do not exaggerate. When I first heard Dr. Jim Dunn, when I first saw him teach, when I first listened to him, and then, you know, to meet through him Ann Braden, a white woman from Louisville, Kentucky, you know, and who had been mentioned by Dr. King in the letter from a Birmingham jail, and whose husband, Carl Braden, had been sent to prison for violation of the sedition laws. All of these folks greatly influenced me. When I heard Reverend Buford, you and Michael Washington teach history, and I fashioned myself a historian, and I was a history major, and I was a seminary graduate. I had never heard history like that. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is teaching history from the very roots of the nation, a history that I have not been taught, and that I realized immediately my participation in that history, first as being a product of white supremacist thought, and later an activist, you know, an anti-racist activist, as we say. The Dr. Jim Dunn is how I met Diana Dunn. You know, Diana Dunn, one of the more outspoken white anti-racists in the nation's history, not just recently. You know, this is a time where the very anti-racism was not really a part of the vernacular, nor organizing with an understanding that it has to be anti-racist in nature, you know, or so these role models, John Moran from, you know, Anishinaabe, and from, you know, what the Grand Portage Reservation. We met at Camp Justice during the late 1970s. Ron Chisholm, Barbara Major, who we met at the Third World Caucus of the Committee of Against Viet. What was CALC called, Daniel?
Clergy and Laity Concerned.
Yes, Clergy and Laity Concerned.
If you want the long part, is Clergy and Laity Concerned about the war in Vietnam. That's when Dr. King started.
That's right. And so it then, after or in the aftermath of Vietnam, those clergy were still concerned.
That's right.
About a whole lot of things. And I became a part of that. That was the passion that I wanted to pursue. I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be a minister within that framework. So my role models are many and varied, and they continue this day. A role model is not just someone who is older than you. Eldership has no age to it, you know. And when I think of the organizing work of Mark George, for example, life that he has led and the commitment that he has had, Marjorie Freeman, whom I would meet in New Orleans as a young organizer, and this sort of thing. So Shadia Alvarez, who's joined us. Hey, Shadia, who was at Antioch when Jim Dunn taught there, and who would introduce us to this teenager from the Bronx, who was now organizing students at Antioch. The list can go and should go on and on, but role models continue to present themselves to me. People who now are at my age and older, who continue to I continue to try to model myself and to try to live up to that promise. So it's an honor to hear Dr. Smith today, and to finally put a face to a name and to a legend. And I won't forget that. I'll tell my grandchildren about having met Dr. J. Alfred Smith, and I'll tell them about meeting all of you. As I just told my grandchildren, I gave them a test. I said, do you know who your parents are? Do you know who your grandparents? You might think I'm Grandpa and Marjorie's grandma, but let's look into them. And I gave them a little test about with different aspects of our various lives, and seeing if they knew about it. Because I want them to know something beyond this is my grandma and this is my grandpa. I want them to know who we are, where we came from, and how we were a part of something that impacts their lives. So thank you, Reverend.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that beautiful testimony, and show how you evolved and your metamorphosis over the years to become an anti-racist. Before we get to the Captain Lyles, I wanted to share a word from Reverend Iberus Hacker. Reverend Iberus Hacker, may he rest in peace, is the man who introduced me to Dr. Jim Dunn. And I was introduced to Iberus in 1978. And not long after that, I met Jim Dunn in that same year when I was a campus minister at the University of Cincinnati. And the very first project that I had was to organize a 2-week program, a community organizing workshop that would address racism and a number of other things, 2 weeks. And Iberus was the head trainer, and he was just in town from Chicago. And so Reverend Iberus Hacker was a white man who died way before his time, but he was ahead of his time, which might be why he's no longer here, is because he was an advanced individual. So this is from a chapter from a book called A Prayer Warrior's Reflections, which is a book that I've written. And this is just a little excerpt here called The View from the Bridge. Reverend Iberus Hacker taught me that few people, and this is a quote, few people can rise above parochial politics in their community work. The problem for many of today's organizers is that they have never really seen how a bridge is designed, much less built one with their organizing. After he pointed that out, I read about bridge designs, constructions, and functions, and could see the profound implications of Iberus' observations. He had learned a lot about organizing and Iberus had mastered the skills of being able to work on any issue and organize in any community, regardless of cultural differences. Iberus was a white man who knew the organizing styles that worked best in each community he worked in. He learned this from building bridges in his community organizing work. There are short and long bridges, low and high bridges. The forms and materials used in building bridges follow their functions. For instance, a felled tree or an earthen dam may be used as a footbridge, and in the jungle, there are rope bridges over ravines. In cities, there are bridges designed for cars, trucks, and trains. Drawbridges are designed with boat traffic in mind. There are bridges over land, water, expressways, and bridges over bridges on freeway overpasses. All bridges have the same function of conveying people and materials from one to another side, and they all have to pass over something to make the connection between the two ends. The connection to the other side is what makes the bridge important and usable. A pontoon bridge and a suspension bridge are designed to carry trucks and cars. I could go into this further, but you can see the implications for role models who are bridge builders between the past, the present, and the future. Social justice movements that are supposed to be bridges. What are the implications of role models who only show people how to design pontoon bridges, which, though temporarily effective, tend to be buffeted about by any superficial disturbance? What about the bridges that we cross every day, like in the San Francisco Bay Area or here in Cincinnati, where most of the bridge that you see isn't most of the bridge. Actually, most of the bridge is under the water and under the bedrock. So then role models are bridges between things that have been and things that could be. And we are helpful, hopefully, those conduits to make that happen. So I'm honored to be able to share that from Iberus Hacker, who led me to know Jim Dunn, which was a meeting that changed my life to this very moment. Earlier, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. Mentioned a man who is not unknown to these Zoom talks, is Captain Reginald Lyles. And Captain Lyles was a deacon of Allen Temple, still is. And also, when I was there, he was an advisor, one of my main advisors, along with Dr. Smith, to the Prophetic Justice Ministry. Now, Reggie and I had an interesting relationship with that because we were both in the same church. But when it came to the prophetic justice thing, whether it was with the state legislature of California, the board of directors, or the city council, Reggie was what I call a gatekeeper, but he was a gatekeeper who was a saint in Caesar's household. A lot of people decry people for having gatekeeper roles, but I can tell you, as being a prophet on the outside, railing against the empire, that it helps to have some inside intelligence and know what people are thinking, because all you're hearing is tell that prophet to go away. He's disturbing us. And then Reggie would let me know why I was disturbing them, whether it was on the Goldman Sachs issue, the crematory issue, the bus issue, or whatever. So Reggie was a saint in Caesar's household, and he was speaking truth to power from within while I was doing it from without. So Reggie, could you talk about that role and bring up again some of the adventures that we had, whether it was the Oscar Grant case or some of the other things?
Well, I want to say that I'm a New Orleanian and a proud son of the South. Got to Oakland and grew up in Oakland and lived in North Oakland. Maybe I lived on 56th Street between Market and Genoa. I think Huey was on his household was on 58th Street, and Bobby Hutton lived on the corner, 3 or 4, maybe 4 houses from my residence and across the street. Bobby Seals lived in the neighborhood on Alene. So we were very, very close. Although they were older than me, not Bobby Hutton, but Huey and Bobby Seals, the whole neighborhood looked up to them. They were defiant because we were constantly being harassed and abused by the Oakland Police Department. I mean, all the time. If you're walking down the street or whatever, you can't come on this side of the street or whatever. So this defiance that they had was just informative to us and enlightening. Then there was this preacher out in East Oakland who was preaching about justice and how to be a black man and how to act like a black man. And so we went out to check him out. We went out because our opinion of preachers wasn't very good. We used to call them chicken-eating preachers and all kind of names. But we got into the sanctuary, and he had pictures of Imamu Baraka on the wall and H.Ref Brown, and we were like, what kind of man is this? We checked him out. He would come out in his kufi and his dashiki, and he would talk directly to us in a way that was totally inspiring. I must have been 20 at the time. And I said, I'm going to worship here. That strategy you talked about, I learned from Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. He was a master negotiator, master preacher, would speak truth to power in a sweet way. He never had to point fingers or use profanity, but it was very dignified, and you knew that you were talking to somebody you had to listen to. And I saw him do that to mayors, chiefs of police, and other people in positions of power. So the neighborhood thugs told him to stay in the sanctuary. Then they can't send somebody down there, hit him in the head with a bottle. And we were so infuriated by that. At this time, I had become a police officer, that I rounded up a group of black police officers, and we showed up at Allen Temple, wearing our guns, wanting to be the protective force. We're not going to let these guys harm somebody like Dr. J. Alfred Smith. He said, no, I don't need you doing that. And we ended up going door to door, inviting people to come to Allen Temple. We went there for one thing. He turned it around to something different. And so I just stayed next to him, became a deacon. And every time an issue would come up, locally or nationally or statewide, that was about someone being mistreated or abusive in any kind of way, we addressed it directly. Clear, concise response. We did nonviolent, mind you, but we didn't back up from anyone. And to this day, Allen Temple Church does not back up. We look for allies, white, black, Asian, indigenous folk. We all in this fight together. And so when the Oscar Grant situation came, where the BART police murdered Johannes Merceles, murdered Oscar Grant, the person who was a trustee on the BART board was a member of our church and a very good friend of mine, Carol Ward Allen. You should have her on one of these talks. So I called Carol up. I said, they shouldn't blame you for what's going on. I don't understand. She said, do you want to be the chief of police? I said, no, I want to reform the police department. Hire me as the consultant. Let me come in. And so when I got in as the consultant at BART, we arranged for Myers Navi law firm to do the internal affairs investigation. We arranged for the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives to come out and do an analysis of the police department, BART Police Department. We ended up getting a conviction on Johannes Merceles for second-degree homicide. It should have been first degree. We ended up getting a brand new chief of police and deputy chief. The chief of police was a member of Allen Temple Church. We redid the whole general orders. We brought in a person like Dan Buford. Every time we would go to different communities, because Bart is in 9 Bay Area communities, so we had to go to all 9 of them: San Jose, San Mateo, San Francisco, Hayward, and we bring Dan Buford with us, and Dan would tell them about racism and tell them why this thing happened and what they needed to do. Then we had to go up to Sacramento, and a member of our church, Sandre Swanson, who was the assembly member from the 13th district at the time, carried the water for us. Sandra and I went to high school together. I'll never forget the day that Dan was telling Sandra, you have to confront the committee that oversees the BART police office in Sacramento. Sandra's advisors were telling him, don't do it, you'll lose an election. And Sandra turned to me and said, is this the hill I should die on? I said, this is the hill. This is the one to die on. Wouldn't have happened if we didn't have those connections. Wouldn't have happened if all of us, Carol Ward Allen, Sandra Swanson, Dan Buford, Reggie Lyles, had not been sitting under J. Alfred Smith, getting senior and junior, getting the education, getting the preachment, the preaching, getting the orientation from the holy text that what we were doing and what we should do is right. We all paid the price for it. We all got scars on our body, but I'm glad we do. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brother Reggie. That was a beautiful statement, and you are indeed I guess you still are, but you were indeed, from as far as I was concerned, a saint in Caesar's household. We were dealing with them on environmental issues. They were trying to put a mega crematorium in our community.
How many bodies a week they said they were going to burn?
They were going to burn up 3,000 bodies a year. So, so you figure it out. So that's barbecue. That's barbecuing season and crematory season overlapped right there. And our speakers made sure to point out that they didn't want to be wiping corpse dust off of their cars after the communion service, or having corpse vapors mingled with their barbecue. And so they turned some stomachs, but they also turned some heads too in talking about that. I wanted to know if Joanna Reverend McClendon is on the line at all. Is she? Okay, she is not. Okay, is Kelly? Is Kelly? Are you? Kelly.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, Kelly. Well, yours is the most youthful voice that is going to be heard on this collection of voices. And so you're a young person who is dealing with looking at role models and trying to find role models in the white community, but in the larger community in terms of people that you can emulate in an ethical way in terms of how you pursue justice in your work. Could you, you're a trauma therapist, and you also have been trained in the Undoing Racism workshop methodology, as well as the other points in your training. Could you kind of give us some analysis of what you've heard, and particularly talking about the importance of role models? And I just want to say one more thing on this, because Dr. Smith reminds me of this. Dr. Smith was brought up in a home, as you heard. He was brought up in a home where his grandmother and his mother and his grandmother were basically the main supporters of him in terms of his manhood. I was brought up in a home where my mother, Virginia Hedges, was that type of a person. Minister Louis Farrakhan was brought up in a home where his mother was that type of person.
Right.
Jesse Jackson was brought up in a home where he was that type of person. So I'm pointing out all of those selves and using myself as an example to dispel the myth about single parent homes run by Black women, because those are 4 instances, and one that I can personally attest to, where Black women not only did the work of a man and a woman, but they did the work of a community in terms of raising up leaders who could stand up for the community. So I just wanted to say that as Dr. Smith paid homage to his mother and grandmother. So Kelly, what are your observations?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Smith. I was actually going to say that was my favorite part, was how you started your story with who your prophetic justice role models were with your grandmother and your mother. And yeah, I wrote that down in my journal. Yeah, just thank you. As a millennial in this work, I often feel very confused about how to move and be in undoing racism. And I think there was a study done about us at one point that we're like the most confused generation on racism because of how disconnected we are from civil rights movement. And so I'm just grateful to all the bridges who are on the call here today, and people who I don't know and people who I'm getting to know that are bridging that for me and for other folks, so that we can keep bridging to Gen Z and beyond. And yeah, it's important because as y'all were talking about prophetic justice, I was just thinking about how much like I grew up in the exact opposite of prophetic justice. Like I grew up in the conservative white evangelical church and learned pretty much the opposite of like a Black liberation theology, and have had to undo a lot of that. It was through the Undoing Racism content at the time, as a very white evangelical conservative Christian. I went through that training, and it felt like that story of Saul in the Bible, where the scales are falling from your eyes and you almost have to be renamed because you're an entirely new human. And it was that content that really woke me up to the fact that I was actually like a Pharisee and not really on the side of liberation movements. And since then, it's just been, I'm just constantly asking folks who are older than me, like, yeah, who do I need to be studying to learn from, and who do I need to be in circle with? Because it feels super isolating being a white person in this work. And so a group of younger white anti-racists that I work with now, we're just trying to sit with, who are the white anti-racists that we want to emulate, both, alive now, like Marjorie and David and folks, and then also what we've been calling like our movement ancestors, like Ann Braden or Lillian Smith, or I've been hanging out with Faith Hozart, who was a part of SNCC, who lives in Durham here, and just trying to figure out, how do I learn enough history? Because as we consulted with our white anti-racist younger organizing, I chatted with Reverend Buford a bit about it, and he gave me this analysis of the bridge and the pontoon bridge. And we realized like a lot of our organizing, particularly after the Trump election, was more like a pontoon bridge that served for like 4 years, and then QAnon conspiracies and all this stuff. And then that bridge just collapsed and we lost a lot of people. And so we're trying to figure out how do we rebuild now in a way that has more strategy, a stronger bridge, not, as Reverend Buford often says, like building a bridge to nowhere, but actually building a bridge to somewhere. So that's a lot of what I heard here is really helpful to me in figuring that out. Grateful for each of you across generations who continue to do this work. And I will take any advice you have for us millennials. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Washington has some historical observations, amongst others, that he wants to share too.
Absolutely. Can folks hear me on this? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Talk a little louder, Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, let me just say that this is a remarkable situation, because Kelly is, as Reverend Buford pointed out, younger. And when her generation was being born, the movement was actually kind of, let's just say that when they met in C.T. Vivian's living room in the late 70s, they were talking about the movement being over, in the sense that people had already achieved those things. So that generation was born at a time where people were thinking the movement was over. We don't have to struggle for justice anymore. So she grew up in a time where the struggle basically was a struggle of whose workshop is the best, whose content is the best. But there was no role model for the actual, what C.T. Vivian referred to as nonviolent direct action, which is what Jim Dunn talked about. Right? And therefore, undoing racism and anti-racism and all these different racial equity and all these different concepts can be achieved just by going to a workshop. And now that you know something, you're better off now. The problem with that is that unless there are people who are actually modeling the actual behavior required to undo the unjust situation, then all that talk and understanding is benefiting the people who can pay for the workshops. So the people who can't pay for the workshops, or the people who the workshop was designed for, now the information is being used against them, because the people who are getting the information can afford it. They're the people who are the gatekeepers, and they're the people who are understanding now what we must do to keep the gate closed. So that whole generation grew up looking at role models that were not directly interacting with the system in a way that will undo, or in the process of undoing. It's a verb. You have to be living a life of taking chances, a life of challenging policies and practices that are not equitable. So unless that life is being lived, it's difficult to have role models for justice or prophetic justice. And that's why this session is so important. And that's why Dr. J. Alfred Smith's presence and all the people, his influence is so important, because they represent that ideal of serving the poor. The poor will always be with you, serve the poor. So that's my quick assessment before we conclude.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Washington. And I want to thank everyone who participated today. And how many more minutes we have?
We can get 2 or 3 more if you want to say something.
Yeah, and I have always something to say as a preacher, but I would reserve that if there are any other people on the call who have something that they want to offer.
Right. Anyone in the audience now who like to say something or ask a question or make a point, by all means, go ahead.
Not all at once.
This is what happens when you do these virtual programs. It takes a few minutes with people. I think Shadi's going to say something. Go ahead, Shadi.
Dr. Mike, I number one, thank you for inviting me. As always, I'm honored to be in these circles, and I'm honored to be with you all, because you all have trained me, taught me, guided me, got mad at me, all of it together with love and community. And so what I wanted to say, I appreciate that, and I wanted to acknowledge it. The other thing I wanted to say is that these institutions are taking this work and they are creating their own versions without any integrity. And so we, part of the organizing and the movement building is we have to be able to, just like they used to say, by us, for us, we need to reclaim the economic piece of this as well. Because if not, what we end up doing is feeding a whole bunch of boards and committees, language and jargon, and it never impacts the actual community that it came from. So, I'm trying to do that. I'm having my baby steps here at Antioch College, organizing with all of y'all. So I just wanted to echo that comment and really support it.
Congratulations on your job there. Could you tell us what your job and your position is?
Yes, my new position is, thank you for that, Executive Director of the Coretta Scott King Center at Antioch College. We are reopening end of February. We are doing a major event in April that I would share with you all and hope you could be a part of and guide. And the work is organizing. How do we organize for justice from every level and every nugget that we're a part of? So
thank you, Shadia. And I think David might have put your age as a little bit older than what you actually are when you were born. But I remember you coming in to the workshops as an undergraduate in college, and your energy, and it's just so good to see you now working to preserve the legacy of Coretta Scott King as a director of the Coretta Scott King Center for Human Rights up in Yellow Springs. So thank you for that comment. Is there anyone else?
Yes, this is Sandy.
Who was it?
Sandy.
Sandy, go ahead, Sandy.
Sandy. Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on what I just heard Shadia say, because I too am concerned about all of these pop-ups, these racial equity experts that are just popping up. The distinction we have is that we're guided by principles, led by people of color. And without that as a guiding structure, in other words, we're using that to vet. Who is it that's offering these trainings? What are the principles that guide your work? And who is leading this, right? So I just want to say that I'm deeply grateful to be on doing racism workshop and those principles, because we wouldn't have any way to discern. We would have no way to discern a pop-up, a well-intended white person, a well-intended person of color from somebody who is grounded in this, guided by principles, led by people of color, part of a movement. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just say real quickly, and Mike might want to have something he has to say on it, but these pop-ups, as you call them, I liken them to mushrooms. The difference between a mushroom and a tree. The difference between a mushroom and a tree, there's several, although they both grow out of the ground. A mushroom can grow up overnight, maybe 4, 5, 6 inches, just overnight out of nowhere. And a mushroom has no roots, and it grows off of dead material. A tree has to have time to grow roots, to sink into the earth. It has to have time to become a sapling and then take root and then blossom and have leaves and all of that. So the difference between a mushroom and a tree are essentially the same difference between a lot of these pop-ups that have no roots in the community, and things that have taken a lot more time in the community and aren't making as much noise and making as much money. I say now, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement organization, which was able to pop up and make a whole lot of money, but really not be accountable to the roots in the community. So much so that they've raised millions of dollars, and not a dime of those dollars has gone to the families of the victims of police brutality and police overreach. So then what we're trying to do today is to be lifting up role models of prophetic justice that aren't your ordinary role models that you ordinarily hear about. We're talking about people like Dr. Smith and David Billings and other people whose names you've mentioned here, and hopefully people will Google some of these names and search them and find out for yourself what kind of a great legacy that they have all left behind. So we thank you for your time and attention. And we have upcoming Zoom talks. One is going to be on art. And we're going to be talking about art in terms of how can art be used to overcome evil. And that we'll have some artists, myself included, on there for that. And then one in March we're going to do is we're going to revisit the idea of role models, but we're going to be having mainly a female panel and talking about once again exploring the idea of role models from the perspective of the women that will be involved with that discussion. So we thank you, Mike.
And also, what we like to do following that is to pick up on this ideal of grassroots community organizing. We see this program really as a forum for getting that ideal back as a way of life. So people can look at someone who's a community organizer who can actually say that they have organized a community, and in that organized community, they have a situation where the police are accountable to the constituents by using the community's culture as a way of holding the police accountable. Their graduation rates in that community are very good, even better than to be expected. So when we look at those kinds of people, those kinds of human interactions, not just people doing workshops, making money to give people who can afford the money the information. So we have to get back to that, and that's what our programming is geared toward. So sometime around in the early summer, so we plan to have a session on how we can support each other's efforts. Like Shadia was just giving reference to her ideal of moving away from all that jargon and that institutional way of doing things, which maintains racism. How can we support Shadia? How can Shadia support us, whether we're in California or New York or Georgia or wherever we might be? So we want to make this program a way of networking and support building, so that we're doing more than just workshopping. So this has been a wonderful program, an excellent discussion. And until next time, this is Afrocentricity. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.